he kind of was predetermined. He felt, I think that the surviving the firing squad in Blizyn, I think he always thought after that, if he survived all that, when he was at Auschwitz, he just said he somehow knew he was going to survive by then.
Wow.
He'd lost everything by Auschwitz. He had lost his clothes, his family, everything. You know, he had, well, I mean, you know, he had the diamond, of course, in his mouth. But he used to always say to us, you can lose everything, but you can't lose what's up here tapping his head.
Hello, beautiful people. On today's podcast, we have the wonderful Tony Bernard. Tony is the author of the new book, The Ghost Tattoo, a story about his father, Henry, a Holocaust survivor, and the journey of understanding the desperate choices his father had to make during this horrifying time in history. What I personally love about this conversation is the point of difference that this story brings. I'm sure most of you would have read and heard stories of the Holocaust, which predominantly seem to center around the time in the concentration camp of Auschwitz. Understandably why. However, as Tony highlights, there were approximately 1 million Jews killed at Auschwitz, which leaves approximately 5 million Jews being killed elsewhere during World War II. It is in this conversation that Tony shares this unique perspective of what his father's experience was like well before he reached the camp of Auschwitz, and how his hardest moments were in fact during the lead-up. He shares of Henry being part of the Jewish Order Service, also known as the Ghetto Police, and of the atrocities and murders that he lay witness to, of how Henry was never able to forgive himself for not being able to save his mother, of how Henry tried committing suicide when awaiting what seemed an inevitable firing squad, which were only 2 of his 5 near-death experiences. We also speak about what Tony believes mentally it took for Henry to get through all of this, which I always find personally fascinating, as there always seems to be a pattern which I believe can be brought into our everyday life and the way that we can show up and face adversity. Please enjoy this conversation with Tony. Welcome to the podcast, Tony.
Thank you for having me.
So Tony, where I want to start is with your brand new book, The Ghost Tattoo, Discovering the Hidden Truth of My Father's Holocaust. This book is a tribute to my father. It is also a part of my long journey to get closer to him, to find out what troubled him so, and to try and help him to achieve the true and deep peace of mind that eluded him to the last. So where I would love to start, Tony, is to learn more about you growing up on the northern beaches with your father, and when you came to realize that this true and deep peace of mind that you speak about came to elude your father.
Yeah, so we just we were born into and grew up on the northern beaches. Our father was a local GP, and we had the beachside kind of upbringing. There's a lake there, so we just had a normal Australian upbringing in a coastal area suburb, and it was very enjoyable. And my parents did actually break up when we were kids, but besides that, we had a very good kind of lifestyle. And our father's very busy local GP. He's very well respected. I'm talking about the era I'm talking about growing up in is the 60s, really. So it was different then. There were a lot less doctors. Everyone knew them. And I just started to realize that there were, as you become aware of things in your parents, that my father was a little bit different. I knew that he'd come from Europe after the war. I knew his parents had died in the war. His girlfriend had died in the war, but we didn't talk about any of that. And I knew he'd been in some kind of camps during the war. He had a tattoo on his arm, and he had his concentration camp uniform, but we didn't know what a concentration camp was. I thought it was a prisoner of war camp. He didn't. He would talk about the camps, but really when you're a kid, you really don't know what a concentration camp is, particularly anything to do with the Holocaust. And I don't think it was that well understood back in the 60s. I don't think people really fully understood what had happened. It was only 20 years after the war. And but there were, we just knew there were areas my father he was quite happy to talk about things that had happened to him in the concentration camps, but anything to do with his family and earlier than the camps, he would just say, I don't want to talk about that. And we knew not to go there. Yeah. The other thing, the other thing that became an issue was our family's religion. We didn't go to scripture. We had no family religion. At primary school, when I became aware of religions and would ask, what religion are we? He would just say, we're none. You can decide when you're 18. And it wasn't until I was in my teens that I found out that we were Jewish and that my father was Jewish. And that's when I started to realize, things about the Holocaust and hear things about the Holocaust and get a bit of an understanding. There was a bit more to his story. But he was, reasonably happy. And that was, you just accept the life of your parents because that's just what you know. So yeah, I wasn't really aware of these things. They came out later in his life as we went through the years, following the 60s, in the 70s and 80s, particularly when we started doing some trips back to Poland. I just should mention one other thing, sorry. And that was when I was 15, he was flown back to Germany in 1970, which was a big deal then. Overseas travel to Europe in the 70s was quite a big deal. No one did it. He was flown over by the West German government to be a witness at a war crimes trial. And he really wouldn't talk. He just said he'd seen some people murdered, but he wouldn't talk about that either. So there was just those kind of red flags that, something unusual. So that's the basis for it all.
And as you've shared, he was quite comfortable in speaking about certain experiences and sort of not going there with others. What was sort of the moment or the experience that kind of began to influence your father to start sharing these stories? Because, as you're on the podcast because you've written a book about these experiences. Obviously, at some point, he sort of came into that space of feeling more and more comfortable with sharing more of his story.
Yeah, it was. So I did my first trip to Poland with my father in 79. I was 24 then. And we did a detail. It was still communist Poland with the Warsaw, with the Iron Curtain and all that. He started to go into a lot more detail, and that was, we did go to Auschwitz and we did go to some of these other camps. But mind you, the other places like Treblinka, there's nothing there. It's just been bulldozed. It's just a memorial. There's no. But I did go to Auschwitz and started to understand the scale of stuff of the Holocaust. And then he did show us a lot of stuff about the ghetto in his town. He'd walk me around and explaining things, but I didn't fully understand what it was about. I knew that the Jews had been put into a ghetto there. Again, his bits and pieces of the story dribbled out over. There was that trip. There was another trip some years later in the 80s, then another one in the 90s. It really wasn't until the 90s, and he was in his 70s, and particularly when he saw the movie Schindler's List, that he kind of really decided to not just talk about it, but to really talk about it. He did this prolonged interview with the Spielberg Foundation that were filming all these survivors telling their stories. And that's when he told us a lot more detail about what had been going on. But I've actually been finding out more and more and getting more of an understanding of his story, really right up until writing that book. It really, when you put it down on paper, you start to understand. And of course, as you know, I got access to the war crimes trial records from that 1970s trial, and 2 years ago, and so I actually have got a better understanding of the trial and what happened than my father did. He didn't really understand the significance of his evidence. So yeah, it really all the pieces of the puzzle really kind of came together when I wrote the book just recently. So I've been learning things all the way.
And you mention the Jewish ghetto, and I think this is important to highlight because, to my understanding, in being a reader of your book, this was one of the hardest sort of experiences for your father to share with you and your family. And it was sort of the beginning of when everything sort of was happening, and he had his involvement with the Jewish Council and Jewish police. And I know for him, I think even in the book, it's described as an experience of wrestling match with his conscience. Can you share more about that time in his life?
Yes. And you alluded to it. The reason he was happy to talk about Auschwitz, because you start to realize actually Auschwitz, being in Auschwitz, which was later in the war for him, 1944, was actually by no means the worst part of his war or his Holocaust. By the time he got to Auschwitz, he had a feeling he was going to survive. He wasn't that worried and traumatized. It was the earlier events, and as you said, the ghetto. I don't think people realize that the Holocaust really started within weeks of the Germans taking over Poland. They started implementing a plan in the towns of Poland, and Poland had a large Jewish population, 3.5 million, I think. Of the majority of the European Jews were in Poland, so they within a month of the German takeover in every town with a Jewish population, the Germans said that they just started dealing with the Jewish community through a Jewish council, and the Jewish community had to set up a Jewish council to administer anything to do with the Jewish community. And my father's father was made a member of this Jewish council. It was just community members, professional people. There were 24 members of the Jewish council in my father's town. So small towns had 12 members of the Jewish council, and larger towns like Tomashov had 24. And the Germans would just say, well, we need 200 workers. The Jewish council would have to get 200 workers for them. There was no ghettos at that stage. Everyone was living in their own homes, but any edict, when they said we're going to have Jews cannot walk on the footpath, you have to stop any Jews walking on the footpath. They tell the Jewish council. They would just give the orders to the Jewish council. It was actually a very simple method for the Germans to administer the Jewish population. And they said now the Jewish council, to carry out all the orders that we're giving it, will have to set up a Jewish order service, Ordnungsdienst, order service. And in my father's town, the Jewish council that used to meet in their apartment, in my father's apartment, they were very concerned when they had to set up this order service. And we're talking about October, November 1939, really early in the war. They were very concerned about the potential for corruption, to be an extortion if they had the wrong types of people in this order service. They were very concerned that they really had to be the best, highly respectable or dependable people in this service. And so they actually put their sons into it. So my father was told by his father that, to join this order service. And so he went into the order service quite early on then. And as I said, the Germans would supply the Jewish community, the Jewish council, with flour or meat, and they go, you ration it. And the Jewish council would have to distribute food to the Jewish community. They just ran it like that. And the order service was involved in kind of carrying out the orders of the Jewish council. And so, that's how it all started, quite innocuous. And then about a year later, and then they had to, in 1940, everyone had to wear the Star of David. As I said, they weren't allowed to walk on the footpaths, they had to walk on the roads, Jews. Then they implemented a curfew. Jews couldn't be on the streets between certain hours in the afternoon and evening and night time. And And they would just, then the Jews couldn't catch public transport. They couldn't go to school. They just would bring out more and more and harder and harsher edicts, particularly against the Jewish population, right through 1940. And then at the end of 1940, they actually did move them into what they called Jewish residential districts, which we know as ghettos in the town. And they moved Polish people out and the Jews into these certain areas. There were at that stage, no necessarily borders, or just designated areas. But then eventually the gates went up and the walls and the wires. And as I say, it just got worse and worse and harsher and harsher. So yeah, that's how it went in Tomaszów. And we're talking again, 1940, 1941. So by 41, the ghettos had been established. And my father said that the orders of the German, see, this is not the SS or anything that doing this. The Germans had a civil administration of the town. They bring in people to work in the town hall and to administer. They keep the existing Polish mayor and stuff, but they have their own administration telling the mayor what to do. And they had a person here who would be dealing with the Jewish council. And my father said this guy was a classic Jew hater, this German administrator. Members of the council, including my grandfather, would have to go to him. He would scream at them, kick them, spit on them, slap them, giving them orders. And when they'd say, we're going to close down, there was a couple of satellite ghettos within Tomaszów. They go, we're closing these and moving to this one within 24 hours. That was my father said. The orders were always very unreasonable. This, of course, meant people couldn't get any transport. They had to leave all their possessions. They had to be marched very quickly and crowded into the existing ghetto. And this meant that all their possessions were left for everyone, for the Germans to take. You could only bring what you could literally carry. That's the way that that's what it was like. It just became harsher and harsher. I mean, the killings hadn't started at that stage, but by 1940, as they crowded more people in, and then they also brought Jews from surrounding villages, they would just pile them in to this Jewish ghetto region, which, as I said, was fenced off. And they would say remove a whole street from the ghetto, and then they'd compress the ghetto even more. Right. And that would be done like within 24 overnight. So everyone had to leave all this stuff. And he said that there was something like 15,000 people crowded into 250 houses. There was 50 or 60 people living in each house. Well, the Jewish police would have to try and sort out accommodation and take a room off some family so they could have to another family, things like this. So it was, they became seen as part of the oppression, or because they were implementing these, but they were doing it under duress, and they had to do it under the orders of the, German. But my father said you could not walk at night in a house without treading on people. Every square inch of the floor was filled with people sleeping because it was that crowded. And of course, this is a perfect environment for disease. And then the other thing that the German administration did is they then halved the food ration to the Jewish population once they were in these ghettos. So they actually implemented it was a starvation regime. And then they brought in edicts that said anyone smuggling food into or out of the ghetto is punishable by death, eventually shooting on the spot. Anyone outside of the ghetto, any Jew, is instantly shot on the spot. So by keeping all the Jews in crowded and then starving them deliberately, they introduce literally a famine. And when people are starving, people will do anything to eat. They have to eat. It's a basic human, force. and they're in their own town. So their neighbours are living just down the road outside the ghetto. Of course, the neighbours will help them. People would have their own. They had possessions to sell outside. People had money. They had jewelry. They had anything, any of their possessions. They would smuggle outside, swap it with a neighbour, and smuggle food in. So everyone was smuggling. They had to because they were starving, and particularly children. Children would be out begging for food because they were starving. And so, people went into the ghettos. When they December 40 was when they actually physically went into the ghettos, looking like fairly normal people, but within this starvation policy, that's when you see photos of ghettos, of people in ghettos. They're in rags. They're like skeletons. They don't actually look. They look filthy. They look, what's the word? They don't look like normal humans. But they went in as normal looking humans, and this is the product of deliberate starvation policy as part of the Holocaust program. And so my father is the Jewish. When this shoot to kill order was introduced in 1941, early, and by 42 definitely, they would be shooting Jews who were caught smuggling food outside. They would always usually bring them from the town where they caught them to the boundary of the ghetto, shoot them on the boundary of the ghetto, and they would then call the Jewish police, people like my father, to go and collect the bodies and on a wagon and take them to the cemetery to bury them. And so my father was involved in more and more of these, cleaning up these murders. And a lot of them were children, as I said. A lot of the children were smuggling. I can go on for 8. I mean, I'm just trying to paint the picture. I mean, I think what people don't, one of the things with the Holocaust, the Auschwitz death camp has come to symbolise the Holocaust, because its gas chambers and crematoriums were built in brick and concrete, so they were dynamited, but they're still there. You can still see there's a physical evidence of what was happening. And so it has become a symbol of the Holocaust, but in actual fact, there was something like 1 or 1.2 million people killed at Auschwitz in these death camps, in these gas chambers and things. But there were 5 million Jews killed at other places, not at Auschwitz. So, the majority of the Holocaust didn't happen at Auschwitz. There were other death camps: Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, Majdanek. These other death camps that were basically bulldozed, so there's no evidence of them left. And the other thing is that of the 5 million who weren't killed at Auschwitz, 2.5 million of them were shot. And that is mass shootings on a huge scale. And to shoot 2.5 million people, you need hundreds and hundreds of thousands of killers. And that's what the SS and the German police managed to produce, was this generation of people able to do all this shooting, because it's very up close and personal, particularly in the ghetto. The most of the murders that my father saw in the ghetto, the police would actually often know their victims, because it was a small town, and a lot of the local police, and this was the other thing that I discovered. My father's town consisted of about 45,000 people, and it was fairly equally divided. There was 1/3 Jewish. There's 15,000 Jewish people. This is Polish Jewish. There was 1/3 Polish Catholic, which was what they normally call Poles, and there's 1/3 Polish people of German ethnicity, or Volkdeutsch. So 1/3 of the town were people. It was Poland. They spoke Polish, but they were often Lutheran in religion, and they were German of origin. And they might have spoken German at home, but they spoke Polish. So it was. And when the Germany took over Tomaszów, or took over Poland, anyone who was of German origin or German ethnicity could declare themselves, take German citizenship. And a lot of them did, some didn't. But this in 1939, with Germans as the conquerors, this obviously had advantages. You became kind of part of the winning team. But so these people, some of these people from these towns, and there were a number in Tomaszów, these Germans would actually become police in the Polish town where they'd grown up. And one of them, the man my father convicted of murder, Georg Betty, he actually started out as an interpreter at Gestapo interrogations, and then went on to become actually Gestapo killer, because the Gestapos needed people to do this killing and shooting. This guy was a butcher, so he was used to killing animals. He was a butcher in the town. That's why everyone knew him as the butcher's son. And my father used to go to school with his daughter. They were library monitors together before the war. And this, so these guys, when the repression started and the killing started, they were actually locals and who knew the people and they were doing this killing. It's really quite, horrendous, really. So he's up close and personal.
Yeah, I think that's what I really came to appreciate about your book and your father's story was, as you shared, for people, like myself, I have no family that has had direct experience with the Holocaust. I learn from other people's stories, and I find the books that I've read really have kind of this centered attention around Auschwitz. And what I really came to appreciate in your book was sort of this early years, with everything starting in 1939 and how it expanded over the next 2 years. And just really, when I was reading the story, I was trying to put myself in that position and try and visualize it as much as possible, just kind of imagining, my community being taken over by other people. And as you shared, your father was put in a position where he would have to wheel people's bodies, bodies that he would recognize, they were friends, friends of family. And this idea of, people being so hungry that children are trying to find food. And it was really quite confronting to read in your book about how direct, how, it almost seems so simple for these people to just shoot children point blank and to shoot people for no reason. And for me, it created this sense of such deep unease that every day it seemed you didn't know whether it was going to be your last day. And as you're sharing kind of people trying to get into this kind of, they're in this survival mode of trying to understand how to survive while still being a community. And to sort of my understanding, towards the end of your father's experience in this, he really got to that point, as I shared earlier, this wrestling with his conscience, that he made the decision that he had to leave Jewish police.
And that was, he had, as the repression became worse through 1942, and there were the killings of the community leaders in the ghetto, and by then there were already rumors of towns being deported, the ghetto, the Jews from various towns being deported to the east. This idea that they're going to be transported to the east for resettlement. They kept reassuring themselves, that the Germans could not be contemplating their murder. They just used to say that this is the 20th century, a modern country can't possibly be doing anything. Things are bad, but there were suspicions that there was something more evil behind these deportations. And when the one of the advantages, the Jewish police were allowed to nominate one person not to be deported. So and I've researched the Jewish Museum, the US Memorial Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. They have published a encyclopedia of camps and ghettos, and in that I read that they actually people were trying to actually join the ghetto police, in 1942 because it was seen as that you would be saved from deportation. So, if you didn't have a job that was essential to German industry, and Tomaszow was a textile town, so for example, Henry's girlfriend Helena and her family had been in the textile industry. She was now a seamstress, as was her mother and sister, and her father was working in the textile industry. They all got, that was called cover. They were working in German industries, making German army uniforms. And so they were going to be saved. Anyone with cover was going to be saved from deportation. There were a lot of tailors and people in the textile industry and a lot of Jewish tailors in Tomaszow. There's a book been written called The Tailors of Tomaszow about the Holocaust period. And all these people who were tailors were all saved from deportation because they were making uniforms for the Germans. But yeah, my father's was his he had this one, he could nominate one person, which was his mother. His father had already died, as you know, of typhus in the ghetto. And so he made a decision on the day of the deportation where he was ordered to leave his mother and go to the assembly place. But he was, given the assurance that she would be fine. And the fact that she was then deported and that he wasn't there to protect her, this is a decision that absolutely haunted him till the day he died. Died in 2016. He blamed himself for not saving his mother. When that happened, that's when he quit the police, which meant that he became, in the concentration camps, he was just an ordinary prisoner. He wasn't a block leader or any of the, a lot of the police went on to become capos or block leaders that may or may not have had a bad reputation in the camps. Some of the capos had very bad reputation, but that was nothing. The Jewish police were not capos. This was before the camps. So in the end, he did quit. As I said, he then spent the rest of the war. The 500 young Jews that remained, those that had cover, after the deportation of the 15,000 to the Treblinka death camp, they spent 6 months in a small walled-off part of the ghetto called the Small Ghetto. They spent 6 months cleaning out the ghetto of all the possessions and shipping them back to Germany. And then when that task was finished, they then themselves were shipped up to the Blizyn Concentration Camp.
And speaking of that concentration camp, there were some very significant experiences that happened there for your father. One of them being that he spoke about, there was, towards the end of his stay there wasn't a day that went by that he didn't know whether it was going to be his last day. Could you speak more about that experience that he went through?
Yes, well, he had a number of near-death experiences during the Holocaust, which I never fully appreciated until I did his story. I think he had 5 near-death experiences. Yeah. And 2 of them occurred in the Blizyn concentration camp. His brother escaped from that camp, as you know. His brother and another man managed to escape from that concentration camp and took photographs. One of the photographs of Henry and Henry's wife, Helena, because that's the other thing. In the ghetto, he actually married Helena, which we never knew until recently. And another woman. The reason his brother Ignacy took these photographs with him when he escaped from the camp was that if you were to get out of a concentration camp or ghetto, you had to have an identity card on you. The Germans did not issue identity cards to Jews. Anyone in Poland at that time could be stopped. You were stopped constantly and asked to show your identification card. And of course, most Polish people would have an identity card, a German issue. They're called Ken Carter. And that's fine. But if you wouldn't last a day without an identity card in Poland. So, just across any bridge or in any city, there would be German guards there, and you have to show your papers. Couldn't catch a train. He couldn't. So Ignaz, his brother, when he did escape, he had some false identity papers made for Henry and the women, Helena and Tetka. And he had them thrown over the wire in a loaf of bread by a local villager who my father didn't know, to my father. My father was called to the wire, a stranger there pretended to barter and threw over this loaf of bread. And in it was these false documents, the idea being that keep these documents, you can get out of the camp. But of course, my father was seen, and he was searched by the Germans. The documents were found. He was taken to the administration section of the camp and was beaten and whipped there, interrogated violently to get the information about who was this guy through this stuff. And obviously, they realised it had something that had come from his brother who'd escaped. The whole idea being that these were such high quality forged identity cards that there must be some involvement of the underground. The Germans were always trying to close down any resistance or underground. And to get, my father didn't know the guy was, to get the information out of him, they decided to bring his wife up and put her in the cell. And like she was told, he's going to be shot unless you can get the name of this guy out of him. That's the only thing that's going to save him. So she was in the cell with him, and then he didn't know. He really didn't know this guy had thrown the stuff to her. And when she realised that they had nothing to offer the Germans, that he was going to be shot, she said, "Look, I don't want to live either. If you're going to be shot, I don't want to live either." So believe it or not, there was a razor blade left on a windowsill from another prisoner who had been allowed to shave, and they decided to try and take their lives. They cut their in their elbow crease region to try and in attempt to bleed to death. But they didn't. They were both alive in the morning. Helena was in a very bad way. She lost a lot of blood. They stitched up my father's arm without anaesthetic, and then he was interrogated by the Gestapo, again, who wanted to know who this guy was. The Gestapo had come from the local city. And he said they didn't beat him. They were polite. But they were just telling him, "You're going to be shot unless you tell us who it was." And he just didn't know. He didn't have a name to give them. And so they told him, "Well, you're going to be shot." And that's when he was waiting in this cell to be shot. And when the guards came to open the cell door, he'd been looking out the window and he thought today's his last day. It was snow on the field, but when he tried to walk out through the cell door, the guard said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well, you've come to get me." And the guard said, No, we have no orders. I brought you some food, and it's not today. So in actual fact, he was taken down a few days later and put in an underground bunker with two others that the Gestapo had interviewed who were also meant to be shot. And they were waiting there for, he thinks, weeks in this underground bunker or dungeon, whatever it was. But finally, at roll call, the shootings were always done at an assembly of all the prisoners in roll call on a Sunday. They were dragged out, marched to the wire with a firing squad there. And they had to wait there for the commandant to come onto the parade ground. The commandant came, talked to the officers, but it was a new commandant. While he'd been in the cellar, while he'd been in the dungeon, the commandant's, the previous one who actually got life in prison after the war in a war crimes trial had gone, and this new guy was there, and they came up and told them, the commandant's commuted your sentence. And my father could never believe that he wasn't shot that day. He just can't, he just said he saw people shot for so much less. So that was his 2 near-death experiences in the Blizyn Concentration Camp. Yeah, but to be dragged out in front of a firing squad must be pretty traumatic. He always used to say, "I just can't believe they didn't shoot me that day."
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, as you mentioned, your father did have 5 near-death experiences, and I know he sort of almost played it down to an extent to luck, which obviously had its place in this, but to go through everything that your father went through for those years, it was more than luck. It was a sense of mental fortitude that is truly unbelievable, and I'd love to know more about what you learned about his mindset in understanding more about his life and those experiences, Tony, because the stories that I've read of other people, there seemed to be a big difference between the people that survived and didn't survive.
Yeah, well, my father was always a very driven man. He was one of these people who, if he started a task, he finished it. As I said, what he used to say to us was, he used to say if I was doing something, I wasn't doing it right. So there's 2 ways to do a job: the right way and the wrong way. And but he would say, like, in the camps and all that, no matter how cold it is and how miserable or how you feel, you always get up in the morning, you go to the tap, you wash yourself. Others used to just sit there and kind of lose the will and just, they'd kind of give up that kind of drive. So he had that kind of drive, and that was something he had all through life. He was very hardworking doctor. He was meticulous. He was a doctor who, and you really do, in your doctors, you really want doctors who are meticulous, who cross their T's and dot their I's. That's exactly, that's what you want in your doctor. And that's exactly what he was like. So it's the kind of same thing that made him a good doctor. It was the same kind of, strength of will and determination. As I said, he kind of was pretty determined. He felt, I think that the surviving the firing squad in Blizyn, I think he always thought after that, if he survived all that, when he was at Auschwitz, he just said he somehow knew he was going to survive by then.
Wow.
He'd lost everything by Auschwitz. He had lost his clothes, his family, everything. He had, he had the diamond, of course, in his mouth. But he used to always say to us, you can lose everything, but you can't lose what's up here tapping his head. That's why he had such an emphasis on education. He was always determined that we get a good education, because he said that's the only thing that is actually your true wealth, is what you've got in your brain, because you can lose everything else. And he did. He lost absolutely everything, except that you can't lose your knowledge and your brain and your intellect. He was always a moral person. He explained some of the moral dilemmas that he faced in the ghetto, but he always tried to do the right thing. So the professor at the Jewish Museum, Conrad Quert, he said, your father had the 4 attributes of a Holocaust survivor. A, he was lucky, which we've discussed, and he was. B, he was young and healthy. C, he was smart. He was clever. He was smart, whatever. And 4, he was he spoke German fluently. If you could communicate with the Germans, you had a better chance of survival than if you just spoke Russian or something, or Polish. Look, it sounds crazy, but when we were kids, walking around talking about, I wanted to do medicine. I always wanted to be like my father, but he would say to me, and it sounds so ridiculous now, but it was just, it was quite a reasonable, rational comment at the time. We just accepted it as a good reason. he used to say, look, if you do medicine or dentistry, that's a very good profession. And if you find yourself in the camps again, you'll do well. You'll be fine because the prisoners will need you, and you'll have an elevated position. If you're a lawyer or you're, I don't know, something else, or you just be digging ditches, Right. And he'd say it wasn't just once. That was a common discussion point of why you should get a profession. And so this is in Sydney, Australia, and we just accepted that as a reasonable, as another reason to go to university, so that you get you'd be okay if you end up in the concentration camp. I mean, it was only 25 years after the camps for him when he was talking like this, so it was just burned into his brain. How could you you can't ignore such a big traumatic life event. It completely affected the way he thought about things. And that's why he had, for example, he had that rifle at home, and he always had a rifle. If we went on holidays, he always took it with him in the car. We thought that was normal, and he'd say, "This is in case if they ever come to get me again, I'll be able to defend myself." And he meant it. I'm just saying, this is a rational, well-loved local GP, and this is the way he thought underneath. Yeah.
I find it so fascinating because, I mean, even in your book you share, it's like you didn't realize at the time it wasn't even something that was really well spoken about, but these were sort of starting to be signs of PTSD, and in going through such, traumatic experiences, then coming into a life like Sydney Northern Beaches, it's not a smooth integration. And, I find from, an external person, it's very understandable that everything that your father went through, that it makes sense that it's still on his mind in terms of preparation for, the possibility that these things can happen, because they did happen in his life. From your own experience, I suppose, what was it like sort of having a father? I mean, you suggest that it was normal a lot of the time, but were there any moments throughout your life that you kind of came to realize, like, hang on, I don't actually think this is normal, the way that my father's behaving on, in a place like the Sydney Northern Beaches where it is fairly safe?
Yeah, look, he was how can I say, he was a busy local GP, did a lot of obstetrics, delivered a lot of babies, and he had a huge practice. The patients really respected him. I mean, as you know, I work at a local hospital, emergency department. I have people come up to me even today. They recognise my name tag, and them or their parents were patients of my father. It happens. I mean, it's happened in the last few weeks. Exactly that, and they always have got a story, or they speak well of my father. So he was a completely normal, functioning person in our society. I would say his PTSD really surfaced as he got older, particularly after his third wife died and he was left the last few years on his own. He would just talk more and more about the war and these experiences and the fact he hadn't saved his mother. And in the end, he talked about it all the time. So, and he started having nightmares, and so it actually all did come back. He buried it all through the bulk of our life, and and in the end, when he was in his final years on his own, he ended up in a high care facility here, resident. He would talk about it all the time with me, but of course I was doing the book then anyway, so I was often questioning him. So it's not all his fault. I was actually, often needing to clarify points, so I was bringing it up as well. And he did bring. I did in his last year, 6 months before he died. I was fiddling around with this book for years. As you know, it started when he got me to sit down with him and video record him in 2006, telling his story. This is how this whole book project started. And it was 9 hours of tape. And and it was me he just thought once he's got the tape done it on tape, that he'd done his kind of duty in putting down what he'd seen. But I said to him, no, look, it really does need to be written down. So that's what I was the one who started actually writing it, because I just said, no one's going to watch 9 hours of tape. But I did put together what I had written up until then into a kind of a book format and got it bound, Officeworks, and took it, and he read it and he said, it's all correct. So he did actually check. Look, the book's quite different from that manuscript. The book's, what I wrote originally was his biographies, but the book is written, his biography through my eyes. But he did, he's verified everything, all the events, and the research the last few years, getting the war crimes trial, just Professor Queerd at the museum has gotten access to documents in Germany. Every document, believe it or not, there are documents about the Holocaust. The Germans did have various files. Every piece of evidence that has surfaced has supported his story. And even to the point where just in the last 6 months, a historian in Poland actually found his marriage registration, the marriage registration book from the ghetto in the archive in Tomaszów. And I've got a photograph of his marriage certificate, which he only told me about a few years ago that he got married,
Wow.
So every bit of evidence that I get does support everything he said.
And in the start of this conversation, we spoke about sort of, this was a journey of potentially helping your father to experience this deeper sense of peace that kind of eluded him. Do you feel like him sharing his story on those tapes and, watching you kind of put together this book, that it kind of provided a little bit of sense of peace that he or you were seeking?
Look, I'd like to say yes. He never forgave himself for not saving his mother. It's as simple as that. He just went on about it right to the end. Even he just, but I shouldn't have gone. I shouldn't have left it. I shouldn't have left it. He just made one of those sliding door decisions that haunted him for the rest of his life. He just kept blaming. He did blame himself for that. He was very supportive and happy that I was writing it all down, because he really did want what he had seen to go on the record for history, or for and the way he would name all the people he saw shot in the ghetto, that was particularly from his evidence at the war crimes trial. But he really did make an effort to name all the people who got shot, so that in a funny way, and I made a point of writing their names in the book, so that if one day someone somewhere in the world's reading it and they go, oh, that's what happened to, like, that's what happened to so-and-so. Like that guy, Yitzhak Rosenblatt, the one who was standing next to him in Auschwitz when he's the one with the withered leg who was selected for the gas chamber. That Yitzhak Rosenblatt said to my father, tell my family what happened to me. And then he went off to the gas chamber. Well, I put his name. So one day a Rosenblatt somewhere might go, oh, that's what happened to Yitzhak. So my father, I think he was wanting to just say, this is what happened to all those people, because you wouldn't know. These people just all disappeared. You just don't know what happened to them.
Mm. And what has been the most rewarding experience for you in writing this book and sharing your father's story?
Well, I'm very happy with the fact that I have been able to, it's kind of complete the circle, particularly with access to the trial. I really do feel I'm not objective, but you've read the book. I've kind of, the pieces of the puzzle type of fitted together. So I think I've done as good a job as I can at telling his story. So that's my, personal satisfaction. It's evidence-based. It happened. It really does put the spotlight on that earlier, deeper Holocaust rather than just the Auschwitz story, which I don't think people really understand. And I have tried to explain the position that my father was in the ghetto police and the dilemmas he faced. And I've tried to say to the reader, well, what would I do? What would you do?
Right.
If you're in that situation? Well, you'd probably, it's just the fact that really if you really think about it, the Jews, the moment the Germans invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939, the Jews were all dead people walking. There was nothing that could be done to save them. Once the war had started, they were doomed. Hitler was hell-bent on killing them, and he had a big enough successful military in those days that no one could stop him doing it. And you realise that they were just doomed. And it's given me it's made me think about the Holocaust a lot more. And I think it's quite amazing that we're having this talk. Putin has just invaded Ukraine, just like Hitler did, and he's hell-bent on whatever he's... it's identical. He has just decided, and he's hell-bent on this crazy path of course of action in taking over Ukraine. Doesn't care how many people get killed and destroyed. And that's exactly, history repeats. And I'm not saying he's going to do a Holocaust or anything like that, but when a dictator just decides to do a crazy thing, you just can't stop them. The world can't, So I don't know if that's answered your question. It's, yeah.
No, it's wonderful to hear, Tony, that you've given this space for your father to tell his story and that you've learnt so much. And I think it's so important because, even in terms of intergenerational trauma, these things can be passed down if they're not addressed and they're not brought into awareness. So I think it's really beautiful that, the reason why I ask you questions about you being younger is, to really understand that those moments that you think are normal, as you shared, is like, you're coming into being an adult and truly understanding, hang on, these are remnants of the past for my father, and to kind of have this full life experience of, your father passed away at 95, which I think truly shows how rich of a life he did lead, and to be able to have that space to tell his story of, particularly in relation to, as you've shared, the suppression that he had for most of his life in not telling these parts of his story, I think would be very healing for him. And I think it's very beautiful of you to give your father that space. So thank you so much, Tony, for sharing his story, and for you also to have the courage to lean into something like this, because I'm sure even in your own experience, it wasn't always easy in learning about these stories, and particularly so close to home, it being your family. I hope you're truly proud of everything that you've created.
Yeah, oh, thank you. It's very kind. Yeah, no, I am. As I said, I've done it as well as I can. So you can't do more than that.
This is true. You either do it right or wrong, right? So yeah. I think that you've done it right. And to any of the listeners out there, I highly recommend The Ghost Tattoo. It was a wonderful book to explore, certainly from a different angle than most books that I have read about the Holocaust. And for that reason in itself, I think it is a big reason to read. So on a final note, Tony, I would love to ask you, what does it mean to you to be human?
I think humans have an understanding of life that most animals don't, because of our brains and our frontal cortex, and we should understand that humans are all the same, we're all equal, that we should not be racist, that we should not be cruel, we should not be murderous or just crazy. That's why I think we have the knowledge and understanding, and therefore we should not be doing any of these things. And we know a normal human would never have produced the Holocaust. It's these abnormal people who do this. But yeah, that's what I think. It's humans have got an insight to life, that we understand that we're all equal.